truth in advertising, I'm not unveiling anything. It says that on the. This is still in the oven, but we are sort of well underway on an idea that we are in and we as a group of 33 people who I'll tell you about in a minute. Michelle is one of them. Um, Trying to take advantage of the peculiar moment in history that we find ourselves in. I have found today enormously energizing, but also humbling, because as an historian and a sociologist of higher education in the United States, I'm increasingly convinced that we all are trying to do something new here, which is we're trying to have a coherent story about investing in human talent in the United States that is not organized preponderantly around something called college. Let me say that again. We're trying to do something we've never done before. We're trying to have a coherent conversation about investing in human talent in the United States that is not organized preponderantly around getting people ready for college, into college, through college, and paid for college. That is our inheritance from the 20th century, whether we like it or not, is a college-centric human capital system. It actually wasn't a human capital system. It was a wartime project. It starts first with mobilizing for World War II, and then in rewarding citizen soldiers with the gift of a 4-year college degree, not a right, but a gift and a privilege. That sets in motion the idea that, at least in theory, everyday people should be eligible for college degrees. In 1940, fewer than 5% of Americans had 4-year college degrees. Almost overnight, the GI Bill kind of changed the meaning of higher education in American political culture. Then the Russians successfully launched Sputnik into Earth's orbit in 1957, which got us the National Defense Education Act in 1958, which is when we start doing omnibus funding for higher education. It's not a human capital project. It's a beat the Russians project, right? Which happens to require human capital, right? And we'll do it through college. Why? Because we don't have a human capital system. What we've got is college. So we're going to use that. And then we do it again. President Johnson does it again with the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was also a Cold War project, right? It happens coextensively with the civil rights and black power movements as a project to demonstrate to the rest of the world that you can have a virtuous democratic capitalism without having it look like Sweden. That's how we got the Higher Education Act and the Civil Rights Acts in 1965. The reauthorization of HEA in 1972 is still the primary funding mechanism for higher education. So we're all trying to do something that Americans have never done before, right? And again, what are we trying to do? We are trying to find new ways of investing in human talent that aren't organized around the frankly mixed bag of college. And I take that very seriously as an intellectual and a policy and a political problem, because if we don't have a coherent narrative of how to invest in people, right, how are we going to get the country back from wherever it happens to be now? I'm not talking about a particular political party, but I think we're in teardown mode. I don't think we're in build-up mode, right? And once we get to build-up mode, I would like there to be at least a reasonably transpartisan way of organizing shared and optimistic investment. So that's what this project is trying to do. The mechanism that we use to do it, and I'll tell you who the we is in a second, is this motivation. There's this huge conversation about the future of work and technology and AI. Oh my God, AI, AI, and well, what are you gonna do about that? And that you fall part of that. And then there's actually a much smaller conversation that you may have been part of. It's the longevity movement. This is one in which conversations about the fact that declining fertility and lengthening lives in industrialized countries around the world, what that means for human capital and economic development, that's often reframed as a sky is falling problem. What? Who's going to pay for grandma? She's going to be old for another 20 years. We don't have enough, right? And the conceit here is that actually both of these things are supposed to be good news. Last I checked, technological change is supposed to be a thumbs up, right? But we frame it as a thumbs down, like, how are we going to keep people working, right? Similarly with longevity, we think about it as being about. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll stand here. I'll do this. All right. Actually, lengthening lives is good news. The problem is premature aging. If we could lengthen functional adulthood, health span, cognitive span, work span, right? Longevity is good news. And if we could prepare Americans to take advantage of technological change, then technological change could be good news too, right? And I would much prefer to organize a social and political movement around good news, right? Like the United States can beat this, right? Than around scary fasten your seatbelts news, which is where I think most of the conversations on both of these sides are happening. And the conceit of this project was to recognize that learning is both, formal education and learning is the world's best longevity medicine, right? The best longevity medicine. Um, and it's also essential for preparing Americans for an increasingly resilient workforce. The subtext is what's going to organize national conversation after College for All? We did College for All for 60 years. We stopped doing that. We're doing something else now. We keep trying to figure out what exactly that is, right? But I don't think we've locked it into a coherent narrative that can, that can get once we get to build up phase. And so I was given the opportunity by the Stanford Center on Longevity, which funded this project entirely. You can learn more about it there. Brought together 33 people from a range of different domains. Only a minority of them were from academia. We had people from organized labor, venture capital, philanthropy, the public sector, to have a long in Silicon Valley. What counts as what counts as thinking is you do half an hour of workshopping the problem, usually on a whiteboard with Post-it notes. Then you have coffee. Then you move to solutioning, right? You move to solutioning, and then you share it. And then you share it on social media, and you do it all again next time. Well, it's really hard to make intellectual progress on hard problems when a deep dive is 30 minutes, right? And so now who has time to spend a year in California like thinking big thoughts on a hill? Nobody. But we took the idea that if we could have a sustained conversation among a plurality of people, we could develop some new ideas where they really are needed. And boy, did that group come through. So here are the two big changes that motivated that conversation that began in September. One is declining fertility. So on the left, you see the blue line is the distribution of age in the United States in 1900, which is when we universalized mass schooling for children. The vast majority of Americans are young. There's a tiny minority of people, a small minority of people over the age of 65. By 2020, that becomes much more a horizontal line. So we now have roughly equal numbers of people in the first 2 decades of their life and the last 2 decades of their life. That's a major change in the organization of human civilization. It's also, as my colleague Laura Carstensen writes, a huge opportunity if we could just prepare people to take advantage of those lives. The other part is the one you know really well, which is from our friends at the Burning Glass Institute on just how much work is already changing, and we know that that's going to keep going faster. So what were our ambitions with this project? We wanted to respond proactively, not reactively, to these changes. We wanted to create an optimistic story, right? Again, it's much easier, I think, to mobilize public sentiment around good news than around, fasten your seatbelt news. And we wanted to come up with some shared definition of what progress would look like. Say what we will about College for All, at least you kind of knew what the goalposts were. Everybody agreed, more college, more affordably, more efficiently to more people, and you kind of knew what the benchmarks were. You take College for All away, what are we trying to optimize exactly, and how do we know, and what's the timetable? I think that's a lot of the ambiguity that we've been struggling with in this room. At the same time, we have a lot of organizational but also cultural barriers to get over. One other is this version of the life course that we inherit from the 20th century, which is there's this thing called childhood. It lasts 20 years or longer, right? That's when you're in this thing called school. And then you make this transition, which is also taking a long time. And then you do something called work, and then you retire, right? That's a 20th century invention. And it's largely, we have argued from this group, that's a function of what social scientists called a schooled society. Now, the United States was first in the world with universal mass schooling in the early 20th century. We were first in the world with the massification of higher education in the second half of the 20th century. That's good news, too. Europe didn't do that. They copied us. We did that. We did universal mass schooling and massification of higher education in the 20th century. And there's a lot of thumbs up for that, right? I mean, we created this narrative that education is a legitimate vehicle for social mobility. We created this idea that everybody should have access to school, uh, enormous human flourishing, cultural efflorescence, economic vitality. In many ways, it was a good 20th century, right? And schooling and our love for it in the United States has a lot to do with that. But it's also a glass kind of 3/4 or 2/3 full. We never figured out in the 20th century how to create universal quality of education, so highly stratified educational system. We never figured out how to pay for the education we consumed. Whose problem is that $1.6 trillion? Is it Stanford's problem because we charge so much tuition? Is it the federal government's problem because they guaranteed the loans and made them, not transferable? Is it my problem because I took out the loan and I shouldn't have? We can't even agree about that. We don't even know whose problem that student loans are. But what we do know is we never figured out how to pay for the college we consumed. We never achieved college for all, that we know, around 40% of adults with four-year college degrees. We separated schooling from the rest of life, so people have to choose between going to school, taking care of their families, and being employed. And probably the most damning thing, and perhaps most subtly, but not anymore, is that we tied basic human dignity to how much schooling you had. So we really have created a two-tier caste system in the United States that's organized around possession or non-possession of four-year college degrees, and we certainly know what the political consequences of that have been in the last 10 years. All right, so how do we get out of this trap? Which is not just, I mean, it's a hard thing to get over because we so many of us have invested so much in this idea of education and schooling and college as a vehicle of social mobility. So it's kind of hard to see it as also a problem. But we think my colleagues and I think there's potentially a way out, which is to remember that schooling and learning are not the same thing. Okay, so we created a schooled society. We did not create a learning society. We created a society in which opportunity and status and dignity are organized around what credentials you have, not what you know, right? And we created a conception of schooling in which we presume that it happens in the first 2 decades of life, and then you transit to something called a career. And we presume that we created these separate organizations where learning officially happens and where it's officially certified. And if it doesn't happen in those organizations, then it's not officially certified and often invisible. That's part of the problem we're talking about here. But learning happens everywhere. It's agnostic about credentials, and it spans the entire life course, right? So it provides a different heuristic for investing in talent. Why do we think that moving from schooling to learning as a heuristic is a good idea? Well, schooling is costly. My former, some social scientists at Stanford long ago argued that part of the challenge, the schooling has a grammar, right? There's a way of doing school that's almost very difficult to change. So we're constantly reforming school, right? But schools look pretty much the same as they did 50 years ago, 75 years ago. Teachers, students, classrooms, hierarchies, credentials, 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 right? That's a schooled society thing. Credentials are a schooled society thing. And it's really hard to get out of that schooled logic, right? And I think we think that that's part of the challenge here too. Oh, and also there's all sorts of cool new ways in which you can learn stuff now, right? You don't have to learn in school anymore. I mean, that's kind of what the digital revolution has taught us. And there's all sorts of new business models. So why would we shove all that stuff just into school when we could create other ways in which people could learn? And then we could rethink our inheritance of this too. I'm almost done. Just like 2 more slides. We have this. What if our ideal life course looked like that? Where, in fact, you don't have one career, you have 3. And maybe taking care of your children or and your loved ones are kind of part of your career, right? And maybe since you're going to be working for, oh, I don't know, 40 years, like maybe you should take a break, right? And like lose 20 pounds and, keep your blood pressure down. I'm totally serious. So you can work for another 10 years, right? I mean, if the future of work people are like 1/3 correct about how much dynamism there's going to be in the economy going forward, then we have to enable people to flexibly adapt over time. And that means sort of imagining human capital investment in a much more flexible and dynamic way. And while we're at it, why don't we create some new social science to help us do it? Because the other thing we inherit from the 20th century, where's Harry? Where are our economists? We have very sophisticated economics of education. It's really an economics of schooling, right? I mean, the units of measure are really gauged in terms of years of schooling, degrees conferred, returns to those degrees, right? We're not instrumented for an economics of learning. If learning happens everywhere all the time, I can't really do an economics of learning unless I've instrumented learning. So I would have to develop a whole new set of heuristics, right, for observing learning, tracking investments, right, thinking about information asymmetries. I mean, to me, that's a pretty cool intellectual problem, right? But harder than just taking wholesale social science ideas from the 20th century and applying them today, but perhaps a lot more interesting as well. So maybe we need a new economics of learning. Oh, and since learning happens everywhere, then if you're going to govern learning, you have to set a new table where every party that's investing in learning or taking risks in entering learning markets somehow has to be there. So it can't just be state education departments and educational professionals. We also have to include, all of the other parties that are contributing to this learning. I'm not going to call it an ecosystem. I think I'm going to, right? That's the other thing. Who proposed the drinking game earlier? Was it you? Yeah, my revision to the drinking game was every time someone says ecosystem, say anarchy, right? I would love to live in a learning ecosystem, right? What a great goal that is to have a learning ecosystem, right? Sorry. No, Oh, thank you. Um, so that's where we're okay. So here's what's going on. So we are in a peer review stage right now, and we've gotten a lot of hard questions, but a lot of optimism too. And I would very much like to build this conversation forward. So I am here partly to learn from you guys and partly to have as many conversations as I can about how to create some porous horizontal conversations for idea generation so that when we get over the teardown phase, we're ready with at least some vague blueprints for what building might look like. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Michelle. Yeah, come on back. So this is really big picture wrap all kinds of reflections on the day. I think we want to have a couple more questions for any of our last. And I was delighted that we came right next to each other because I think you guys really kind of surfaced the stakes, right? One, that there are other ways of investing in human capital. I mean, I whispered to my colleague over here, it's like you guys have a tradition to build on that we don't have in the United States, right?
Like national skills councils,
Yeah.
Which are the institutional manifestation of trying to sort of break out of old ways of thinking.
Like the chart that we're comparing the Irish system to our system here. If you were to summarize, would you say that their system is based on proactively designing credentials based on a set of standards and structures, and ours is after the fact, maybe we gather data and say whether they have value, and then maybe we do something about it or not, and move on with the next credential. I just want to kind of understand the bottom line between.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I guess the argument in the United States has always been, let's not put any structure in the way. We want to encourage innovation, and to be fair, like it's a super creative space. Like all this stuff is happening, right? It's the Wild West, and so the good news is it's incredible. It can be incredibly innovative. So innumerable actors are doing really creative things and filling this space with all kinds of stuff, right? And the very first person who taught me anything about this field was Roy Swift, who said to me about 20 years ago, you know, half of this is just completely worthless. We just don't know which half. And
Right.
you did. That was Roy. So, I mean, obviously, everybody went out there, like all the Coursera's, all the enterprising universities, all the ed tech firms, all the industry groups, and build all of this stuff, right? And we're trying to kind of get our, maybe we shouldn't, but we're trying to get our hands around it a little bit, and we're doing it in a very American way, which is to sort of start with some sort of private and loosely coordinated initiatives, and those have been creative, but we'll see where this goes. But it doesn't speak to the big. I mean, we need that's small stuff. It's the big stuff is like rethinking the big picture within which all of this gets embedded. So that's like level 2 stuff, and you're talking about like level 1 stuff, which is like how do we sort of think about.
Well, let me tie those two things together, because one of the things, I mean, the federal government created the market for higher education. That's what the Higher Education Act of 1965 did. It put money in people's pockets. And that's why we know what we know about legacy credentials, is because all of those monies come with a reporting requirement. So if you want data, just dangle I would suggest, even a little bit of public money, and just put a reporting requirement next to it. It's not rocket science, right? I mean, that's how it's really not, right? I mean, but somehow we forget that the federal government creates the human capital systems that we have by creating incentives or not creating incentives, right?
But I'll make a terrible confession.
Yeah.
Years ago at NCS, we were working on the creation of a national student unit record data system, which Congress, in its wisdom, and the last time it reauthorized the Higher Education Act in 2008, prohibited us from advancing.
You know why? Because the fancy schools didn't want it.
I know.
That's why.
But given where we are today, given what Doge is, okay.
They didn't want it.
Yeah, no.
They didn't want it.
We got our.
Well, fine. That's what I'm saying. But last I checked, there's a little legitimacy crisis.
No,
I mean,
NICU, National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, beat our brains out, and so and the power of the prestigious private universities is enormous. So yeah, it was blocked. But I mean, I guess one of the questions we'd have to ask ourselves now, I have, as a lifelong advocate of student unit record data systems, which was, as I watched what Doge is doing with individual level data, I'm starting to think that a distributed solution of a sort that people were talking about, a federated solution with more safeguards around it, although I guess things can always be subpoenaed. But I'm a little worried. I've lost confidence.
I would just add also that ACRO was very tracking the system, mainly because we were concerned that student privacy would not weren't enough protections around it, and so we have now come around. Probably a better, but we know we need the data.
I also advise against the rule because it bypassed the states and their engagement in the process.
Correct.
This is their data, it's their institution, so they need to have a role within that space. So it's a complicated question.
Well, and the conversation has evolved. I think actually it's probably the learner's data, not the institution's data.
Well, it depends on
ultimately. But that's a pedagogical, not a pedagogical, but it's a philosophical difference that Europe has already moved in that direction and the rest of the world is moving in that direction. We're still struggling with that, but yeah.
We have one more comment here.
Or could we just collect a couple more and then?
Yeah.
Okay, but we won't respond.
You're bringing up the idea that the data belongs to the learner, which I would agree with.
Well, and I think we need I think we need a positive incentive. I mean, the great thing about Sputnik, right, is it scared the daylights out of the entire American people, right? And we turned it into a very positive moment for state building. And I used to have a hard time conveying that feeling to students who didn't live through the Cold War, but AI has that. It has that, right? And if you say, we need to do this so that the American people can continue to prosper in the next 10 years, right? You can shift the conversation so that it's about nation building and state building, progress and optimism. Then I think maybe we can get some things to happen that haven't happened in the past.
I was talking earlier about the active citizenship and
Yes.
that sort of stuff, and that's sort of ingrained now in Europe. So when you're talking about things like privacy, we take that for granted. We take that the state. It comes down to that word trust, and there has been a huge erosion of trust, obviously on this side of the Atlantic. But that's not to say that it hasn't happened on our side at all. So I think from that perspective, but there is that notion that state actors are there for the good of the public. And I think that's why initiatives across Europe in and around active citizenship, whether it's from supporting inward migration, outward migration, we talk of things like New Irish, we talk all of those things are really, really important. And so when I hear a lot of the things, I can understand it from a logical perspective, but from an emotional perspective, it's around that notion of trust. And I think you really have, you were talking about, for me, when you were going through, we're moving to learning, I was like, yeah, well, we've done that. And I think that's something in Europe. But yeah, I was like going, in my world, we've done that. So you will hear the whole rhetoric in Europe, it's about flexible learning pathways of formal, informal, and non-formal learning opportunities, which really equates to everything you just said and the lovely pictures. You know what I mean? So yes, and that's an important, but we've just inculcated that into our way of being now. And I think if you look to where a lot of the presenters here today were talking about, they're trying to, as you said, trying to keep that system, 20th century system of schooling, because that's what people trust.
In Europe, it's backed by there's a big initiative around things like individual learning accounts, like creating learning accounts so then people can use that across the life cycle. And that's a sort of one manifestation of a new vision that you were talking about.
I think we are going to wrap up, but let's give a round of applause. Wonderful. Fantastic final panel. Couldn't think of a better way to end. Michelle, do you want to say a few words of thanks and kind of, yeah.
We just want to make sure to thank all the people that really helped contribute to making this a great day. So we want to thank all of our panelists. We want to thank, we had a group of advisors, I think I forgot to acknowledge at the beginning, but Roy Swift, Jeff Stroll, Kevin Bentley, and Ethan Ellis all helped kind of advise in leading up to this. And we're very active with the strategic planning. So I want to recognize and share our appreciation. Also want to recognize a team both from Rutgers, from ERC, Eliza, Justin, Melissa, and Tracy, and also Kyle's team, Micah and Tom, and all the others who've helped make this day a success. So thank you all for being here. We also really want to thank our sponsors. Lumina Foundation has been a great supporter of the conference over the years, and also we're very grateful for Strada Education Foundation and Pew Charitable Trust for also chipping in for the foundation to make this a great day. So thank you very much for that. We appreciate that. So I guess there are other big things. We want to keep this conversation going. So keep in touch with us about webinar ideas. Keep in touch and let's continue the conversation. After this, we're going to have some tables set up for panel discussions to continue. So we'll put up some signs for which panel is going to be at which table. If you want to come and congregate around those topics, we can do that. Ethan, I don't know where Ethan is. You want to raise your hand? After the reception, so we have until about 5:45 here for the reception. Ethan is going to informally organize folks if they want to go out for drinks and whatnot after. So find Ethan if you're interested in that. And I don't know, what else? Do we have anything else to wrap up, Kyle?
No, I mean, enjoy the beautiful DC weather. I guess the good news is that there was no extra charge for for the patio rental. So yeah, not losing anything.
And we also really want to thank our caterers and our videographer too. I should
Absolutely.
recognize them for
John
really making this a great day. So thank you.
That's right. I've got nothing else. So thank you all. Be in
Thanks all for being
touch
here.
and please, please, please sign up to do webinars.